Welcome back to another episode of the Royal Palace podcast. On this episode, as a part of a multi-part series, we're going to be talking about Minitel, France's internet before the internet. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Liam. So we touched on this briefly on episode 7, Europe's Internet. But now we're going to really take a deep dive in. Patrick's been researching, and he's going to tell us all about Minitel, including me, because I know almost nothing about it.
To eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk, stall and surrender.
All scientists, dynamists, are proponents of the cultural form the
Who Americans have given not the sense was very evil,
great again.
As we said on our episode of Europe's Internet, Minitel was essentially a predecessor to the modern internet that we know and love today. But too often it is dismissed as just that, a predecessor, a relic of our networked history. And it's sort of assumed that in technological progression, there's always improvement, and that things as they were before were necessarily worse, and that's why they lost out in the battle of history, if you will. Minitel, of course, in many ways is just that story. Minitel and the technology behind it was not as complete as the technology that would give way to the World Wide Web. However, it was one of the building blocks upon which our modern internet was built on, and it was also in some ways, it's kind of looking into a parallel universe, because we can see how many decisions that were made in 1980s France are very distinct from those that were made in the internet's or the commercial internet's early days, so in the 1990s, and that those decisions had a meaningful impact.
Hold on, let's take a step back. You said that most people often just dismiss Minitel as merely a predecessor to the internet, but I think actually probably for most of our listeners, they have never heard of Minitel before. I think outside of France, even within France, I don't feel like I've heard people talking about it that much. And outside of France, if you're not have a deep interest for the history of the early internet, you might not be familiar with what Minitel is at all. So what is Minitel, simply put, Patrick?
Minitel in many ways worked like the modern internet. You could purchase train tickets online, check your bank account balances, you could play games, read the news, order groceries, talk to strangers, use government services even, and they even had a smart home function that allowed you to control appliances within your smart home.
But let's give people a better picture of this. So you've got a computer, basically?
Yeah. So the way Minitel worked, is that you had a terminal. Now this terminal would be available in your home or in your workplace, and in many ways it looked like a modern computer. You had a keyboard, you had a screen, but unlike the personal computer, the terminal is just that. It's an access point into the world of Minitel, into the connected world of Minitel, and it wasn't a personal computer that also came to prominence in the 1980s, in the sense that it didn't have the computing equipment on board that you would need for non-connected networking services. Now, we'll get into how this kind of all works a little bit later, but the thing to know is that unlike the personal computer, which did achieve some sort of mass adoption among a very narrow section of the American population and the global population in the 1980s, the lightness, if you will, of the Minitel terminal allowed it to reach mass adoption across France, because personal computers, despite being democratized in the 1980s, were just too expensive and difficult to produce for a mass adoption. Now, before we kind of get into all the details of this, I want to talk about kind of the birth of Minitel, like where Minitel comes from. And that all sort of starts with the idea of a postal service. Before email, there was the telegraph, and before that, there was the post. An often overlooked feature of the nation-state is the importance of a public postal service. This is because, as a liberal institution par excellence, the Postal Service embodies state power to achieve what private industry could never do itself, which is an end-to-end communications network which can guarantee both the fidelity and efficacy of its own communications, as well as those of private individuals and enterprises, independent of specific interests or the unprofitability of infrastructure and service. I think we all kind of know this intuitively, right? I mean, the Postal Service has the advantage of that it reaches everywhere, right? I mean, I always give the example, Liam, of some of France's overseas territories, like La Réunion, which has postal service that reaches places that are inaccessible via roads, via the traditional road network, and they send a helicopter with a man with a backpack who hikes to the practically uncommunicated villages in order to deliver them official notices, letters from friends, whatever it is, right? And that's unique to the nation state. That's unique to the revolutions of, France and the United States in the late 1700s, because you needed a way in which the state could, one, exercise its power, right? The state wouldn't want for private companies to be able to interfere with its communications, right? Changing its the content of its letters, and at the same time, they also needed to ensure that profitability wouldn't get in the way of that everyone would be under this communication system, even if it wasn't financially, from like an industry standpoint, worth it. So as a result, the USPS and the French Postal Service were some of the first institutions of the modern liberal state. One of the interesting things also about the way the post operates is, despite it being public, or actually precisely because postal services are conceived as a public service, they are actually less accessible to many forms of public interference that you might have in a private service. A great example of this is the USPS needs a warrant in order to just open your mail, inspect your mail. They need to follow due process and procedure, and if they violate that, you have some degree of legal recourse.
Is that not true for private operators?
Yeah, when you send, it depends on the country. I don't know. I suspect France probably offers more protection, but I don't know. But I know, like in the United States, for example, if you send a package with UPS and the authorities suspect something's in it, UPS basically opens the package for them, because in your like carrier contract, they say, well, we're willing to, collaborate, basically. So like a common thing is, if people who send drugs via mail, usually, even though it's more of a crime, or it can be more of a crime to use the U.S. Postal Service for illegal activity, they will use it nonetheless, because there's more due process in terms of package inspection.
Yeah, so good tip there for our listeners.
But the interesting thing there is that, yes, something created by the state is, it might be worrying to some, and this has parallels with the modern internet that, I hope our listeners will understand by the time we're done with this episode. But it's sort of the very fact that it's controlled by the state that it has all the guarantees that we enjoy. That's not just preventing people from opening your packages, it's also equal treatment of mail. Communications at a specific postage rate are meant to be treated the same no matter what. You can't just say, well, this is an important company that needs its mail delivered, therefore I'm going to deliver it faster than other mail. And that's because there's legal frameworks that the state imposes in order to ensure that not only can state communications be transmitted efficiently and with a high degree of fidelity, but also that private communications between private operators, entrepreneurs, individuals can be free and fair, and that there's a kind of notion of equality imposed on the system. For some history here, the United States Post Office was established in 1775. In France, the Postal Service became a public service in 1793. And just to really drive home the idea of like the accessibility of these services, in France, rural areas were served by daily delivery as early as 1832. Now, another important aspect of the Postal Service is that it is kind of the first object of international law because the guarantees that are insured within France, within the United States, needed to be insured when messages or letters would be transmitted between other countries. So a great example is that in 1874, they created the General Postal Union, which essentially set fixed rates for sending letters to signatory countries. So that included Prussia, France, and the United States, as well as several other European countries. This would ensure that there would also be the notion of like equal treatment of domestic and international post, and that the legal guarantees would be insured, right? And this would allow for commerce essentially to happen in a fair and transparent system. All over the world, the public post served as the basis of state bureaucracy, employing thousands to ensure its daily operations, architecture, services, and to develop new methods of accomplishing their mission. The public postal bureaucracies would be the driving factor for technological innovation, including the telegraph, air travel, trains, boats, and automobiles. In most countries, using air travel for any sort of commercial purpose would be in the postal sector.
Yeah.
Some of the first routes are like Paris, Bordeaux.
Yeah, Aeropostale. Weren't they one of the first or the first commercial aviation companies in the world? And they were founded to the mail, basically.
Now, these innovations further expanded the prominence of the institutions behind them. And by the 20th century, most European countries, say like Germany, France, the Netherlands, etc., would have a single ministry responsible for it all. And these were known as PTTs, so Post, Telegraph, and Telephone Ministries. This moniker of a PTT it really comes from France, but we use it to describe all the services that accomplish the same mission in other countries. Now, this is a bit different from the way it worked in the US, where the USPS was actually kind of kneecapped very early on because they made the Postal Service run on its own revenue. But just to give our listeners an idea of how important these ministries and services were, France's PTT employed almost 500,000 people by the mid to late 20th century.
Wow.
So what does this all mean? Well, it means that in European countries in particular, phone and postal services were provided to consumers directly by the state, right? Because eventually they would get into telephone communication.
And telegraph, of course.
Right, which was the basis for telephone. Yeah, so that's the important thing is in the United States, like telegraph was actually largely private operators who got initial systems up and running. And I just don't believe the USPS took the same role that PTTs in Europe would in the development of the telegraph. But the very sort of statist European models would see essentially these ministries being in charge of, not only postal routes, but also telegraph operation and the infrastructure that's associated with it, as well as the actual delivery of telegraphs, and then eventually telephones, right? All the telephone wires, the lines, the service providing. In most European countries, that was handled by the PTT in-house, which is, as many Americans probably know, very different from how it worked in the United States, where commercial telephone operators was the norm. The development of these services and having it run by the state and these through these PTTs meant that they became a major source of income for the state itself. And this was very good in many ways because it meant that the money could be used to fund further infrastructure, improving services, but also it could be used for completely foreign purposes, right? You could use the fact that telephone service is profitable as a way to fund education, for example. Modern PTTs also, through this whole process, acquired immense technical capacity in-house and experience in infrastructure design planning, as well as the management of technological change and the manpower necessary to practically will any project you might imagine. Imagine you were in Europe in the 1960s and you wanted to create a networked, basically a predecessor to the internet. Well, you would look at where the expertise is, and it wouldn't be in the military as it was in the United States. It would actually be in the PTT. So all of this, for France's specific context, meant that France had a world-class postal service, and they were on the cutting edge of telegraphy. However, by the 1960s and the 1970s, France lagged behind the United States as well as the United Kingdom in terms of post-war telephone infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So what this meant is that wait times were incredibly long and much of rural France was poorly served. And much of the system still through the 1970s and even the early 80s, relied on manual switchboard systems. Imagine you wanted to make like a phone call from Paris to Bordeaux. In the US, by the 1970s, the way this would work is you dial an area code followed by the rest of the phone number, and that would go to your local switchboard, basically a routing point where calls would go towards and then be dispatched from. And they would use automated equipment in order to be like, okay, this area code, I need to relay this call to the next switchboard. And they would use the area code as a way of figuring out which one that actually was.
Which was like a modernization of the previous system of having an actual operator who you had to tell what area you're trying to call, right?
Exactly. And importantly, like in a fully manual system, this would involve you calling the local operator. So you would have to know how to connect with the regional operator. And that regional operator would literally pick up a phone and dial the regional operator of the region you're trying to reach, who then would dial the person you are trying to reach. And then they would all connect, though each sort of router along the way, switchboard along the way, would have to manually connect that call. In order for this kind of connection to work, you had to not have enough operators, but also enough physical lines to make these connections. So imagine in the 1970s France, this was still, there was automation, but this still existed. And that made telephone calls in France were too expensive, too slow, and didn't reach the entirety of France. So they were in a bad place in terms of their telephone infrastructure. In terms of informatics and computation, France was also lagging, notably behind the American company, which collaborated with the Nazis.
IBM, of course, notoriously.
And so, yes, there was a French hardware company, for example, in 1960s France, but that was actually purchased by General Electric. And you might imagine that sent some political shockwaves through France, because at the time, in the late 1960s, we had, as president of the Republic, Charles de Gaulle, who is a famous anti-Americanist. And he essentially said, okay, well, we need to do something about this. And he came up with the so-called plan calcul, like the calculating plan, which he thought would revolutionize France's internal computational R&D by essentially giving money to French industry and trying to promote public research for technology. This later materialized in 1971 into the Plan Informatique pour tous, or the informatics plan for everyone, which essentially would attempt to create internal demand for French computational hardware by making the education system purchase computers in order to train students on the new technology. Now, this is particularly important because, computing hardware was really expensive at the time, and the only way you could get the economies of scale necessary to have like a national French champion that can make hardware at the scale of IBM is you would have to find people who are willing to buy it. And who would be willing to buy it if it's not proven? So essentially they tried to artificially create demand for it. Now the US did the same thing, right? Like the US would essentially adopt in military and university sectors, unproven technology that not everyone had a concrete idea of what they wanted to do with it, but they would nonetheless buy it as kind of a way to drive industry. So when Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was elected president of the Republic in 1974, France was in economic crisis owing to the global economic situation and the end of the so-called 30 glorious years.
30 glorious years. I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail at some point. Les 30 glorieuses, still seen sort of as a golden age of modern France, which is between the end of the World War and the oil embargo crisis in the 70s that threw all of Europe into crisis.
And in terms of politics, do you know much about Giscard?
I mean, he was sort of a proto-Macroniste, wasn't he? He was sort of the first liberal, no?
Yeah, in many ways he was that, but he was also kind of the bridge between that ideology and Gaullism, because he too was skeptical of the United States. He too kind of had like this nationalist vision, but ultimately, with France suffering its economic crisis, the collapse of Bretton Woods, his legacy would be profoundly liberal. Some of his notable achievements include TGV and nuclear electricity.
Yeah, which isn't very neoliberal. Those are both massive state-backed industrial projects, but he still imposed austerity. So it's wrong to say he was sort of a Reagan figure, but he pushed France. I mean, it was the end of France as this fully state-led post-war welfare state, right?
For our listeners who don't know, TGV is the high-speed train system that France has, and his government would essentially push for the development of this high-speed train, which, by the way, was a considerable accomplishment at the time. I mean, it was supposed to bring France into the modern era, at least in the ideology of these people. And nuclear electricity, for our listeners, in case you don't know, is still how most of France's electricity is produced. And it's been quite successful as a program.
Yeah, both of those are definitely successes, even if you're opposed to nuclear energy, which I think is definitely an argument that can be made. They both were successes of the French industrial state, in that France has long been a leader in both those industries, remains so to some extent, certainly in nuclear. They've fallen a bit behind in high-speed trains, but they still have one of the best networks in the world.
Now, during the 1970s, like many public institutions, both in the US and in the rest of Europe, the Centre National des Études de Télécommunications, also called CNET, and for our English-speaking listeners, that would be the National Center of Telecommunication Studies, had been working on computer networking technology, notably a protocol called X.25 or X25, an early networking protocol, which we might eventually make into a bonus episode if anyone's interested. Now, the thing is, this technology was developed in France, but it was also with collaboration in sort of international research circuits. So this include American research into early networking technology as well. So this wasn't like X25 notably was not profoundly French. It was actually like an international protocol that was developed by the various quasi-international regulatory bodies, if you will. Now, looking for a magic bullet to France's telephonic woes, because Giscard did find the magic bullet for France's train woes with the TGV, for the electrical problems or the energy problems with nuclear, right? Because at this time, it was right after the OPEC oil crisis. And so, he kind of as this bridge between post-war liberalism, the end of the 30 years, and the eventual neoliberal era, would also be looking for kind of the magic bullet solution to France's technology problem. And so the way he did this was by commissioning a study which would eventually become known as the Nora Mink Report, which essentially argued for the fusion of telephonics and informatics. And so that's why we get this popular term. I mean, I don't know if any of our American listeners have ever heard it, but it's a common one in France called telematics, right? The idea of combining phones and computers, basically. And this report predicted how the networking computational age would essentially reshape society as a whole, right? We get a little bit of, what do you call it? The cybernetics kind of undertones there. And so this report managed to convince the president of the republic that the government should pursue this networked vision of France. And it argued that we should do that by making the PTT coordinate the entire operation, right? Because the technology wasn't developed by the PTT, at least not like the underlying technology. That would be the role of research institutes. But the actual, bringing a technology from a more research or theoretical arena into actual implementation requires somebody who has experience with it. And no one has more experience than the modern postal services of Europe. So following the decision to move forward on this telematics revolution, progress happened at a remarkable pace, with state engineers overseeing the semi-public deployment of something called Transpac, which was the data network based on a slightly modified version of the X25 standard I mentioned earlier. The network mirrored the operations of that of the telephone network. It essentially used much of the same infrastructure. That's why we always talked about dial-up in the early 90s, because dial-up was essentially just repurposing phone lines to do data transfer. So instead of switchboards, so imagine we said in the telephone network that there were switchboards, and physical operators or automated systems would ensure that calls get routed at these switchboards. In this Transpac network, they used what were called PAVs, and basically these were basically computerized routers, so automatic routers that would be in between every connection. And that difference is actually kind of important because it meant that the state had kind of a lot of control over the network they had created because they controlled the paths. So they could use paths to obstruct certain network traffic. So they could use the paths to ban a website, for example, or a service that would be available on Minitel. Right? They could exercise meaningful state censorship, which we'll get into a bit more later. Instead of IP addresses, Transpac used short codes. So the way these worked would be you would essentially type in a code, and we'll get into how the codes were attributed a bit later, but essentially that call would go to the PAV, and then the PAV would route the traffic through the network in order to reach the server on the other side. Importantly, this is a bit different from like the German equivalent of this system that would be also created in 1983, because they opted for a much more centralized model. Because in this French model of Transpac, you could easily like have a node, like a user, Liam, for example, at his home in the Paris region, connecting to a server in, say, someone else's home in another part of France. Whereas the German network preferred that people's servers actually be hosted in a central location that was controlled by the Germans' PTT. So they weren't for this more decentralized model. And that's also an interesting thing that we'll get into, which is that often Americans accuse this system as not being decentralized, and that's why it failed. But we'll get into why that wasn't the case in a bit. So in order to achieve wide-scale adoption of this Transpac data network, beyond research institutions and other industries, right? Because that was the way the ARPANET, the predecessor to the modern internet, worked, right? It was purely just for like research and academic institutions until it became commercialized in the mid-90s. Whereas, Transpac had the ambition of reaching everyone's home. So how do you do that? Especially how do you do that in a world in which no one's ever done it before? So a lot of additional work was required, and you had to imagine how to actually deploy network infrastructure across the country, how to develop end user equipment, which would be affordable and producible at scale, create an environment that would be conducive to actually developing services, right? Because it doesn't matter how good your network is. If no one's on it, it doesn't matter, right? Famous network effects that economists love to talk about. And you would also have to, determine like the actual procedures of like, how do you get on the Transpac network? Do you allow just anyone to run a service? Do you allow traffic of all kinds? Do you want to make sure that there's no child pornography going across the wires? Do you want to restrict speech? All those questions had to be answered. So in order to do this, essentially the PTT would come up with the idea of like doing test deployments of the Minitel system. Just after 2 years of putting in production, right? This is a common term that you use in the technology sector to mean like deploying something, right? So a few years after putting in production Transpac, the PTT deployed various sort of test experiments of connecting different households in Brittany and Paris to this brand new network. So these initial deployments focused on kind of getting user feedback and seeing what worked and what didn't, and to kind of help the PTT guide its eventual design of the system. But of course, it's hard to convince people on the theoretical advantages of a networked computing age. You actually need to have something on there that can kind of inspire them and convince them that there's some sort of use in all this. The PTT internally, through its own engineers, developed an early phone book that they essentially just took the existing phone book and digitized it. But instead of it just being like a textual reproduction of it, they actually made meaningful transformations. So you could do searches, like you could do search queries that even allowed for spell checking, like very early error correcting in search queries.
So, but a searchable phone book doesn't seem like a big enough feature to get people to use this. I mean,
yeah. So at the time in 1980, it was just kind of the first service that would become one of the first services that would become available to like test households, because the whole part of the ideology here is that they wanted to do what the Post did. They created a basic network that could ensure fidelity and efficacy, and then upon it, private operators would take the reins.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the PTT needed to get the ball rolling by building a phone book. They would also get some government services to get on there, early government services to get on there to provide administrative information for people. But they didn't want to be driving what it is you did on the network so much, because they didn't see that as their role. It wasn't a part of their ideology. This is different than other deployments. So like in Germany particularly, but also in the UK, they kind of developed similar systems on a much more like controlled, like specific usage purposes. Like they had in their mind what they wanted to get out of it. Whereas the French were much more, I want to say neoliberal, in the sense that they believed that the market would take care of it, but liberal also in the sense that they believed that it was their job to focus on infrastructure and user interface and that kind of thing. One of the arguments also that was advanced to the idea of a digital phone book was not only that like a properly digitized version of the phone book is actually more useful than a physical phone book, but also the argument was that this could actually spare the PTT from printing the phone book. Because at the time, anyone who had a telephone line received every year from the PTT a free phone book. So they kind of argued internally, and I don't think there's actually a whole lot of logic to this. On the Wikipedia page, I think it states without evidence that this was highly profitable. The fact that they got to delete the paper phone book by providing a digital one, I don't think that's true, and I haven't found any evidence for it, at least. Now, this brings us to the famous Minitel terminal that we mentioned earlier. So as I said, the Minitel terminal was conceived as something different to the personal computer. Some examples of early personal computers, like in the 1980s, were the Commodore 64, or later the early Macintoshes, right? And these all had the problem that they were very expensive. And France's ambition here was to connect the whole country, connect everybody. They wanted to see the Minitel in workplaces, they wanted to see it in homes, libraries, schools, what have you. And personal computers it just simply could not be done. They were too expensive, for one. In some cases, you could argue they were too complicated for users. And there just simply wasn't the production capacity to output the amount of PCs that you would need. Mm-hmm. The solution was to conceive of a terminal, or a so-called light client, which essentially means that it has only the minimum amount of components necessary in order to access the network, and where computation can be performed on infrastructure as opposed to on the client itself. Any chance you can think of some examples of light clients, Liam?
Light clients. Oh, I guess is it kind of like a Chromebook, basically, where it can't really run any applications? It can just access the internet?
That's a great example. It's really funny because Google marketed the Chromebook as if it was a new idea, but in fact it was not. I mean, it was a terminal. Mm-hmm. And Minitel was just that. So on Minitel, believe it or not, there was no storage, local storage. So you couldn't download anything onto the terminal itself.
That seems like a big limitation, because if I think about like one of the main features of early computers was as word processors, right?
So that's true, but the thing is, most people in the 1980s didn't have a computer as a word processor. I mean, certainly some people did, but at the time, honestly, the typewriter was more than effective as a word processor.
And there were electronic typewriters, right?
Right, and the electronic typewriter, like the more expensive models in the 1980s, could actually do backspace without whiteout. Mm-hmm. You basically had a word processor. So France was not trying to solve the word processing problem with Minitel. Of course, the more futuristic among the PTT's engineers and leaders, they certainly imagined something greater for it. But at the time, the goal was to create networked services. They saw the only advantage of these terminals was networking. They were not trying to solve the personal computing problem. This slimming down to the Minitel terminal meant that the cost per unit was extraordinarily cheap, and so cheap, in fact, that the government would eventually have La Poste, which is the post service in France, handing out Minitels free to anybody who already has existing telephone service.
Wow.
But just to give you an idea of like some of the experimentation that was being done at the time is everyone knows the QWERTY keyboard in France. If any of our listeners have ever been to France, you probably know that France uses the austerity keyboard. All of this comes from typewriting, and typewriters have always had sort of these different formats, for their specificities of using a physical instrument in order to type.
Yeah, and the austerity keyboard is, by the way, sort of notoriously terrible. It's really difficult to type an uppercase vowel with an accent on it.
Yeah,
it's you just can't on a normal. Which is ridiculous, because that's plenty of French words start with an e with an accent, for example.
And so this shows actually the importance of these early Minitel tests in the 1980s, because they were able to kind of figure out what worked and what didn't with consumers. Because originally, one of the ideas that was floated is, okay, well, we're no longer constrained by the rules of the typewriter. What if our keyboards were ABCD? Because anyone can figure that out. Your grandmother knows how the alphabet works. So they just laid, there was a test where they laid it out as ABCD. Unfortunately, this didn't work, or fortunately, this did not work. however you want to look at it. And they eventually just settled on the AZERTY as the standard. It was the least friction, ironically. They thought ABC would be less friction, but I think anyone who knows, once you've learned a keyboard layout, you're pretty stuck to it. Now, these displays that were on these devices were 8 inches, black and white initially. That's actually really small for a display. I don't know if you can imagine an 8-inch display, but that's about double most phone screens, probably. Maybe a little less than double at this point.
Yeah, and smaller than all laptops, right?
It's like an iPad mini, I'd say. Although, of course, it was like more of a square aspect ratio as opposed to the modern 16:9. In addition to the screen you had and the keyboard, you had a modem, right? That would be essentially your way of connecting to the network. And then you had a microprocessor, which was a very minimal microprocessor. So as I said, it's not intended to be doing all the computation that a modern personal computer would. As I also said, there was no storage. But in addition, I don't know if any of our listeners know this, but there was know what RAM is or what memory is. But it's essentially like storage that your computer uses in order to temporarily store information for computational purposes, because accessing like a hard disk or a floppy disk or whatever long-term storage device you have is very slow. So most personal computers and every modern computer that you have today will have RAM in it or memory. And they didn't have this in the Minitel, and this specifically would save a lot of money. Now, how did the storage problem get resolved? Because obviously, like when you would look up something on the phone book, you would want to remember it potentially. So the way they resolved this was by a serial port, which would allow you to connect peripherals. So you could eventually connect storage devices, but you could also, and this was the most common thing to do, you could print out paper, right? You could print out something you found on Minitel, which I hope to our listeners, we're already seeing a little bit of the irony of the idea of getting rid of the phone book as a way to save money. Because, of course, if everybody is just printing it out, yes, you saved money for the postal service, but I'm not sure if you did for the household.
Was it common people to have printers in their household at the time? That seems like that didn't have much use before computers.
Once Minitel took off, printers became more commonplace, especially because, again, it became the main way of saving stuff on Minitel.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to put you kind of in the idea of how did this terminal work in practice. Like you really want to conceive of what this was like. So you would start the terminal, like you'd push the on button, wait a bit, and something would appear on the display. You would pick up the handset, right, like a phone basically. You would dial 11. You would wait to hear the dial tone. Once you heard the dial tone, you would click connect, a button called connect on your keyboard. This is return on the modern computer or enter on the modern computer. And you would put down the phone since your connection had been started. And then when you were done, there was a button that said end on your keyboard. I'm sure many of our listeners who have a modern PC keyboard would see that these keys actually are still can still be found. I mean, the font or the end key is still on most PC keyboards. So in 1983, the PTT, after only 5 years of designing and testing the Minitel system, would launch it to the general public. This, of course, did not mean that everybody got connected immediately, but of course, it just meant that the infrastructure, the underlying components were there. And in order to ensure that this would actually translate to user adoption, the PTT sought to democratize it. And the way they did this was through the minimal design I talked about earlier as a way of keeping costs down, but also you'll notice there's no pointing device, right? There's no mouse in this setup. The keyboard was slimmed down to just the bare necessity. The screen and the whole terminal was actually like one piece, right? It wasn't like, you had a personal computer box and you hooked it up to a display and all this stuff. It was supposed to be like as simple as possible and as attractive as possible. They encouraged best practices. So they wrote these fantastic guides that would help users get connected, to help service providers create their own content. They spent, I mean, you can't imagine the bureaucracy that was behind this and that was intending to make the transition in the network age as easy as possible. However, they did impose some restrictions on what could appear on Minitel. But unlike the kind of common narrative that, if our listeners haven't heard, it is a common narrative among sort of like internet historians that the problem with Minitel was that it was too closed. Again, I think we'll see why that's not true, but what I want our users to understand is that, they really wanted to create this kind of open framework that could be built upon. And so as a result, the PTT sought content liberalism. So they did not want, so long as nothing was illegal, they would generally allow it to be developed on Minitel, and they would create like the administrative procedures necessary for services to get online. And they went so far as providing like material assistance to service providers in order to develop their services. So they would make their connections, they would subsidize their connections in certain cases in order to encourage people to build different services. Kind of feels like the modern internet in that sense, right?
Yeah, so these were kind of think of these proto websites, right? These different services.
Yes.
So give us some other examples of what you could do on there.
So I have a great thing about and I took this from a book which you'll find the link to in the show notes. They kind of do this cheeky thing of before there was a modern internet company, there was, and then they cite the French equivalent. So we can do that now. So before there was Webvan, there was 3615 TMK, which is telemarket. Now, do you know what Webvan is, Liam?
I do not.
Webvan was a .com bubble company which lost $1.2 billion and laid off 4,500 employees. Now, this, of course, was in the 2000s. What they did was they delivered grocery services to your door. So you would go online, you'd place your order, and then someone in a van would show up with your groceries. This was considered revolutionary in the .com era. That's how they got $1.2 billion. But it didn't work. The company collapsed, and everyone said it was a failure. But that was not the case on the other side of the ocean. In France, Telemarket was just one of dozens of delivery companies, and they did not suffer the same financial fate as Webvan. And one of the important reasons for this is that the PTT was very much involved. If it was agnostic or relatively agnostic in terms of the content that would appear on Minitel, it was very involved in the infrastructure. So one of the big problems with the modern internet that we all know and love is that it is unfinanced. No one knows how to pay for services. Google was a revolutionary search engine. Today, we all know it's gotten really bad. But how did they finance themselves? There was no model to do that. The internet infrastructure provided no solution. As a result, Google essentially had to create one, as did all the other internet services of the 90s and early 2000s. And that model that they came up with, that the free market led us to, was the ad-based tracking internet surveillance model that we have today.
And how did Minitel work?
So Minitel, because you had the PTT at the center of it, who kind of had this bird's-eye view, was in the early 1980s debating about like what would be the way to ensure that service providers are financed so that they don't go down the rabbit hole of undesirable business models. And what they eventually came up with was also a reflection of the Minitel system itself, where they handed out free terminals as a way of encouraging adoption. So instead of charging, once you got a Minitel terminal and connected to the network, instead of charging for the privilege to have like a monthly connection to Minitel, they instead decided to charge by the minute. And this is owing to the semi-centralized nature of Minitel, by which you have these paths that are in between you and your connection, which allow the PTT to track how much time you spend on Minitel. And so what they would do is the PTT would charge you a fee for every minute you spend using a service. And then on the other side, they would give a certain portion of that fee, or essentially charge the user with a fee, in order to pay for the service time to the service provider. So imagine you connect to Le Monde, a famous French newspaper. Just the mere fact of browsing their website, you would be paying the PTT about 30% of the connection, and the rest would go directly to Le Monde. Now, this meant that service providers had instant revenue once they had a convincing service. So Telemarket, for example, didn't need to borrow $1.2 billion in venture capital in order to have a viable business model. Instead, all they really needed to do was set up a server, design a website, and maybe hire one van driver, and then they could expand their business model based on usage. And in fact, as far as I understand it, they didn't even charge a delivery fee because all of their profits or all of their like added value was from the actual time people spent browsing for different things they wanted to order. So this meant that, services like telemarket could be easily started by pretty much everyone. I mean, anyone, which is why there were dozens of these grocery delivery services in France. They didn't have to borrow money because they got money from the actual service fees charged by the PTT. And thus, you never had the French.com bubble of the same sort you saw with the modern internet. Now, the way this kind of all worked was through what was called the kiosk. So this is modeled off of the newspaper stand. And I'm sure anyone who's been to Paris has seen like these kind of like newspaper stands. We call them in French kiosk. And so they modeled the PTT modeled their kind of like billing and directory system off that and called it by the same name. And in this kiosk, or like through this kiosk, you could attribute different short codes. And so like publications would have the short code 3615. And so you would dial, like to connect to Le Monde, you would dial 3615 Le Monde. To connect to SNCF, which was also considered a publication for complicated reasons that we might get into in a later episode, you would dial also 3615 SNCF. SNCF is the national train company. And so these connections were billed up to 1.25 francs per minute, and 1/3 of that billing went to the PTT. Then you had 367, for example, which was professional services, and it was the highest cost services. So not all services were billed at the same rate. So for example, lawyers or doctors would have a service on 367, and that would allow them to charge relatively high connection rates in order to finance their services. And that made a lot of sense, right? Like imagine a chat room where you chat with a lawyer to get legal advice. They wouldn't actually charge like your credit card. They would instead just charge a connection rate.
Which you would then get in your phone bill at the end of the month, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And importantly, and this is interesting because I think a lot of our American-minded listeners might be thinking, oh my God, this is like a huge concern. You're giving the state so much power because they get to build these connections and they have all this data. And like, I mean, there's obviously a certain truth to that. But let's compare this with the modern internet. When I want to go to Le Monde, I go to Le Monde, and it's basically unusable until I agree to sign up for an account. And so I create an account with all my personal information, and so then they have that, and then I have to make a payment. And in order to make my payment, I have to provide maybe the zip code or maybe even my billing address that's linked to that, and Le Monde gets all of that information. This system, since it was moderated by the PTT, meant that Liam could connect to Le Monde, the PTT could bill him for that, and then Le Monde can get paid for that, but the Le Monde would never know that Liam visited their website, right? They weren't able to actually track that specific aspect of it. They never collected Liam's payment information or personal information. Mm-hmm. Not only did this create a financing model for this early networked age, it also guaranteed Liam some privacy. And the PTT went so far as to ensure that on your actual billing, you wouldn't see what the connections weren't logged, like what specific connections you made were not logged. This was because, as we'll talk about later, many sex services would eventually become one of the many uses of Minitel. And, husbands and wives didn't want their connection to be visible to their spouse. Now, not all services, though, were charged. Some were partially charged, so partially subsidized, either by the service operator, well, always by the service operator, and these were on 3614, and some were toll-free, so 363. What this basically meant is that users paid nothing to use them, but the service provider paid the PTT. You can imagine certain, government services, perhaps, where that would be necessary.
Again, it's the same as how phones work, like 1-800 numbers, right?
Exactly. So yeah, some of the advantages beyond the privacy aspect would also just be the environment this would create. Right, this would create like an incentive, and did create an incentive for websites to build compelling websites that you would actually want to use, and search engines would be financed. So early kind of Minitel search engines were financed through this per minute model, which meant that maybe if this system had been transposed into the modern internet, we never would have gotten the Google ad overlord model that we currently have, because they would just get paid for every time we connect to Google and every time we as users get a benefit out of it.
It's interesting. It kind of makes me think of perhaps surprisingly, of these Web 3.0 blockchain people who, the more compelling part of that idea is that the blockchain could be used to finance things in a similar way. Very easy way to do microtransactions. You know what I mean?
It's funny, right? Because these people are acting like it's a new idea, but also they're missing the point, which is that the only reason this was possible is because a centralized government authority was weighing the options, weighing the costs, the political interests, and made a decision as a result, and somewhat imposed it on the rest of the network. I'm not stating whether or not there's any viability or not for these Web 3.0 things, but if we're talking about things like this 25 years into the history of the internet, it's because there's a fundamental infrastructure problem in the internet that might not have been inevitable, and I think that's really important. Now, another reason that you might want to do this per minute system, because at the time there was a lot of criticism of it. Private industry in particular was not happy with it because they thought it stifled innovation, and to some extent it did, right? There's certainly business models where you might want to allow people to connect to your website for free without necessarily relying on ads, right? Or you might be a private provider who wishes they could finance their service on ads. Certainly some people might have argued naively at the time that, ads are not going to be what destroys the internet. Although I think we all today can agree they basically have. But there was another reason that the PTT was reluctant to hand over the financing aspect to the private sector. And that reason was the fact that there was at the time no safe way to make digital payments or to make online payments. And in fact, today there's still no safe way to make online payments. I mean, some things have gotten better, but in the 1980s, the way you would realistically make a payment, if it's not through some sort of centralized phone billing system, is to type in your credit card number. And I think, as we know today, that is really bad because all someone needs to do is find out your credit card number and then they can make purchases anywhere they want. So this system is really insecure, and it is why pretty much every American at this point has found a suspicious charge on their account and has had to call their credit card provider. And it costs the credit card industry probably millions, if not billions, a year in fraud. And in a world in which you have centralized government authority, you have a bureaucracy in France that is, technically competent, they sort of decided that this is a problem that needs to be solved as opposed to allowing the free market to solve it. So just before I explain how they attempted to solve it, I want it to be really clear for our listeners. Today, in 2024, you cannot make a secure payment online because most of our credit cards rely on just information that appears on the credit card. And if there's been any improvements, it's mostly been in so-called anti-fraud detection systems, which often use machine learning in order to detect when somebody is making a suspicious purchase. So it's generally linked to someone's behavior that, a credit card transaction might be blocked or require an escalation like to two-factor verification in order to go through. All of this relies on very invasive technologies. So when you use a modern payment system on the internet today, it's tracking behavioral aspects of their users in order to detect the fraud. So there's a huge privacy downside there. And I can only imagine that if PTT engineers were not aware of this eventuality of the modern internet, they were certainly aware that there was a problem with the way online payments would be done if no one did anything. So the solution that the PTT, as well as the government as a whole, came up with was to create a digital credit card. And the way they did this is the Minister of Finance essentially ordered the banks, the French banks, to get together and form what in France is called the CB group. So this is an interbank network where all the banks sat down and said, okay, how are we going to create a single credit card system that for the modern age? And the way they did this is by inserting a little chip into the credit card or in the debit card that would allow users to prove that they are in fact in possession of the card that they are trying to make a payment with by inserting it into a peripheral, like into a little card reader, as well as by typing in a PIN code. If this has become somewhat familiar to Americans, it's possibly because they've visited Europe or because their card in the last few years has become equipped with a chip. Do you remember more or less when this happened to you, Liam, in the US?
Yes, I don't remember, but it was only a couple of years ago. Yeah, when I first moved to Europe, they definitely didn't exist in the US, or they weren't common, but they were the norm in Europe already.
Yeah, and that's because France invented the smart card. And the idea here was you would be able to make Minitel-based transactions by inserting it into a peripheral which you could buy, or which would eventually become standard equipment on later Minitel models. If this technology had followed us into the modern web, we would have largely solved the problem that we still struggle with today.
And why couldn't the modern internet adapt this? Why couldn't you just have a chip reader in your computer?
The thing is, we have done this, but because it's not organized in any meaningful way, it can't take off. So many IBM computers, for example, had smart card readers built into them, but they were mainly used in the enterprise, and they would be used to log in your computer. I mean, many places still use smart cards for those kinds of purposes, but without mass adoption, it just doesn't work, right? The CB group was ordered to do this by the Minister of Finance, and they had an interest in doing it because they wanted to make their payment system compatible. But there's no equivalent force in the United States that would push this kind of thing, never mind at a global level that could coordinate this kind of thing, at least not in the neoliberal era. And I think that's kind of one of the important things here is like in the 80s, France figured this out because they had the engineers and they had the political will to do something about it. And I just don't think you can see that in the modern internet. As an example, Estonia, famous for how digital it is, right? They have probably the most performant e-government in the world, and they rely on smart cards for their citizens to identify themselves. Because that's, again, another problem with the modern internet, which is that identity is basically, do you know a username and password? But obviously for important stuff, that's not great. So in Estonia, they all use smart cards. But because smart cards are not standard, like smart card readers are not standard equipment, they have to distribute to their citizens, every citizen, a USB card reader.
Yeah, luckily barely anyone lives in Estonia, so not a huge problem.
But it's really disappointing because, I mean, this technology works, still does work, and the only impediment to adoption, I think, is just will and the ability to organize it. And I think that's a common theme in the world of Minitel, really, is that, you know, a lot of these things were solved, and they just weren't solved in the internet world. So beyond these sort of infrastructure innovations that were pushed by the government, I propose we continue with the services, looking at the different services that were on Minitel, because these really do show just how modern this platform was. So again, I'm taking from the book that I invite all of our listeners to read. I encourage all of our listeners to read. You'll find it in the show notes. But they have another example here, which is before Alexa and Siri, there was Claire and Sophie. So we all know the famous Alexa and Siri, which exists to mostly take your data, I imagine. The government created Claire, which was essentially a chatbot that provided people with administrative information, like, you know, just basic government information. And the way it worked was there were actually just an army of representatives who would answer people's questions live through a chat platform. And again, this was easily financed thanks to the permanent billing system. Meanwhile, Sophie was a system which provided advice on cultural activities around Paris. And again, these were not artificial intelligence. These were real people getting paid to do real work. Before there was Ticketmaster, there was Billetel, basically various operators, including newspapers and Fnac. How would you describe Fnac, Liam?
It's like a combination bookstore and electronics store.
They got their business off really with selling concert tickets was one of the big things.
Oh, really?
And they did that via Minitel. And you would either print them out at home, but since, as Liam, you alluded to, not everyone had a printer, so you could actually just pick them up at the local Fnac. Before the Internet of Things, there was Dominique, which was the Minitel's Internet of Things. And it's kind of funny because I feel like if you look at tech news or tech academia, there's a lot of talk, and there has been a lot of talk for maybe the last 14, 15 years about the Internet of Things, right? Putting computers everywhere, digitizing everything. Well, this already had started in the 1980s with Minitel, where they had a sort of vendor-neutral system that allowed you to plug in different smart home devices into the serial port of your Minitel. Basically, you would have a hub that interacts with them. And, you know, they would allow, for example, your smoke alarm to directly call the fire department, digital thermostat or connected thermostats, control your lights, security systems, and even appliances. I thought this was a bit funny. In the book I pulled this from, they also say what I was thinking when I was reading this, which is, why would you want your oven to be connected to any network at all? There was no need in the 80s, and there still is no need today. Now, a big part of this, though, beyond just like these kind of cool like services, is the role of the role of newspapers, because the internet is remembered today as killing the newspaper. And indeed, that was a fear that the press lobby in France had over Minitel. They were worried it would kill them. But in fact, it was actually, at least the Minitel, in the internet, it hurt French media, that's for sure. But for Minitel specifically, it actually saved many of France's traditional newspapers because it gave them new sources of revenue. So Le Monde, Libération, all these newspapers would create websites that had way more than just the news. They would have chat rooms, puzzles, and games. They would be able to access new audiences who might not have read the news because they would be attracted by those services. Contrary to belief, that the idea that this was like a centralized system with like strong government control, these chat rooms, including the one of the Liberation newspaper, which is a known left-wing newspaper in France, was used to organize anti-government protests in the late 80s. And importantly, unlike the internet, the French press lobby managed to actually kind of instill their monopoly in the Minitel regime. They sort of they actually made it harder to set up a service in order to try and prevent, competitors from coming on the scene, which is kind of interesting. Perhaps in the cultural memory, one of the most significant aspects of Minitel, even though the PTT tried to downplay it, was the so-called Minitel Rose. Liam, do you have any idea what that might refer to?
Only because you told me about this earlier, but it refers to the sex side of Minitel, right? The what is that called in phones? Phone sex, right? But text-based?
On one hand, you kind of just had the transposition of like more traditional like in-person sex services or that of telephone sex services. You also had the creation of kind of like fetish or different like sexual communities online. Notably, it was a place for people to explore their sexuality. You would have the proliferation of various queer and gay services and messaging, chat rooms, forums, if you will. And this manifested itself in a very public way because French society in the 1980s, for all it was conservative, it was also much more open culturally, I think, to sex than 1980s America.
Which has long been true of France. I mean, that's kind of a stereotype we Americans have about them, and it is to some extent true.
Exactly. And that's how all over Paris you would see ads for Minitel Rose or like services on Minitel Rose, with just naked women, basically, posters, bus stops everywhere. It was really wild because, these services, because of the per minute billing policy, quickly amassed enough funds in order to advertise in the real world. And that's the interesting thing of Minitel. Minitel had a huge impact on advertising, but only or principally in the physical world, especially because a lot of forms of advertising were not allowed outside of the newspaper circle. Like, for example, ads for classifieds were only allowed on newspaper websites.
And speaking of Minitel Rose, a figure we will talk about next week, a bit of a teaser there, Xavier Niel, who is one of the richest men, a billionaire, one of the richest men in France and very influential. And the reason we'll be talking about him is because he owns Le Monde. He made his fortune at a very young age on a Minitel sex service, which is pretty crazy. So, I mean, people made huge fortunes off of this.
Yeah, I mean, it was wildly successful, and I think there's a lot of critiques to be levied that we'll look into on future parts, but there is something to be said for the fact that Minitel became profitable in under 10 years in France, whereas the internet really didn't prove its commercial viability from a service perspective until the mid-2000s, maybe?
I want to take a step back here for people who, to contextualize this, for people who, like me, are not as familiar with the history of the internet and of personal computing as Patrick is, and emphasize again that this is the 80s we're talking. about, right? And all these things that we're saying you could do on Minitel are, of course, all things you could do on the internet today. But in the 80s, if you had a personal computer in the US, what could you actually do with it as a comparison?
Very little. I mean, a lot of times people would, there were several solutions. So some people would create like local networks by just physically exchanging floppy disks between themselves with different software on it. But another way people became connected, especially towards the end of the 80s in the United States, was through services that were very similar from an infrastructure perspective, like from the way they were built to Minitel. And these were things like CompuServe, America Online, Prodigy, just to name a couple examples. And these were essentially closed walled gardens of services essentially similar to Minitel, but again, they were locked in. So if you had Prodigy, you couldn't access an AOL service. If you had an AOL account or an AOL service, you could not access services outside of that. And that made the private commercial American internet, or pre-internet era, if you will, completely not viable. And all these services combined never achieved the deployment in terms of numbers, sheer numbers that France had. I mean, the height of Minitel, there were 6 million connected terminals. CompuServe, I don't even think hit 1 million.
Wow.
In the United States, a country so much bigger than France. So networked computing in the 1980s was very much marginal, and the brilliance of Minitel and the internet is the idea of a universal platform for which things can be built upon. And that was just not possible in a world in which you had competing networks where you couldn't crosstalk.
So to clarify, if you wanted to buy a concert ticket in the 80s on your brand new Macintosh in 1984, could you do that?
Not unless there was an equivalent service on a videotext platform like CompuServe that you had signed up for, assuming they even offered service in your area, and assuming you could find the right thing on that service. I mean, I just can't express how marginal these early connected systems were.
I guess that brings us to the question of, was Minitel expanded beyond France? Did it make it to why didn't the US adopt this?
Well, that's an interesting thing that I hope we'll get into in more detail on future parts. But the long and the short of it is, Minitel was considered a massive success in France, and those looking in from abroad saw that as well. However, there were a lot of things changing at the time. We had the so-called protocol wars, where everyone was arguing over what's the best way to communicate information across the network. But you also had a shift that had started at the beginning of the story with our transition out of the 30 glorious years into neoliberalism, and the PTT would eventually be gutted and privatized into France Telecom, which we now call Orange. I think we talked a little bit about this on our episode about the Europe's internet, but you no longer saw an ambition to develop and push forward Minitel as a network, and instead you saw an attempt to try and sell it, to make it a pure commercial product. So France Telecom did try to roll out Minitel in the US, but I think we're talking like early 90s they tried. So it was already too late because the internet at that point was predestined to take over. And it suffered the very same problem that Minitel solved, because they were going to launch it as a commercial operator in the United States that would compete with CompuServe, Prodigy, and the likes. Right? So it wouldn't have the mass adoption, and people would have to pay for their own terminals, and nobody wanted to do that. The beauty of the Minitel system was that the government said it is in our interest to make this work, so we will suffer the upfront cost because it will work in the end. So that made it poorly exportable. With that being said, I believe Ireland, surprisingly, had a relatively well-connected Minitel setup, and you could actually access Ireland services and other international deployments of Minitel through a special short code. But it never obtained the success that it had outside of France. And again, on future episodes, we'll get into maybe some of the reasons why and kind of some of the politicking that happened at this time. But ultimately, the factors that made Minitel possible were kind of the factors that made, the changes in the world we were experiencing at this time kind of made Minitel stagnate, because they wanted to turn it into a profitable venture as opposed to kind of adapting the network to the new protocols available to us thanks to the World Wide Web and TCP/IP. But the legacy of Minitel remains significant in like French cultural memory. I mean, ask any old person in France; they'll have a story or two to tell about Minitel. Even in the 90s, many like essential services still relied on Minitel, and in fact, there were still millions of connections to the Minitel network active through most of the 2000s until it was shut down in 2012.
So why did, I mean, I understand this is probably a huge question, but to sum it up, why did Minitel fail in the end? Why did not it evolve further into becoming an alternative to the internet or a rival to it?
So at a high level, I think that Minitel was not a failure. It was a wide success. And the reason it did not translate into the 90s was because the things that made it successful were no longer being pursued. And you saw sort of a creeping of private logic into Minitel, which said, no, we need to make this a private thing. We need to export this. We need to get the rest of the world on it, just as technology was evolving. And Minitel wasn't. And the PTT was no longer empowered, I think, to make Minitel what it needed to be in order to compete with the eventual internet. Also, you had the PTT kind of resigned on the issue, and they started focusing on mobile networking technology, which, to be clear, they made a huge impact in. Most of the early telephonic standards were either created by or created in large part with the contribution of the PTT and eventually France Telecom. But yeah, I think ultimately you had like a market-seeking logic and a desire to privatize the PTT, as well as just like an overall tendency of austerity and neoliberal logics in the world, but in France, which would sort of push out the many factors in state power and state competency that brought us Minitel in the first place. And also this created kind of a new world in many ways. I mean, you mentioned the founder of Free, right? The guy who made his money off of Minitel Rose. He became a billionaire in part because of that. And he would eventually create his own telecommunications provider. And so like that's also like a changing of like whose hands acquired capital in this time and who became in control of France's future in many ways. I think that Minitel also kind of played a part in reshaping what was already happening at a more macro level, but reshaping the French state for the kind of neoliberal era.
But yeah, if we look at both from the perspective of the internet, it sounds like Minitel had many qualities or solved many problems, as you said, that the internet still has not solved. And furthermore, France, as everyone in the French government bemoans today, and European economists bemoan today, is far from being any center of technological innovation in the digital sphere. And so from that perspective, it's a huge failure, both that the innovations that Minitel made that were better than the internet were not integrated into the internet, and that France lost their edge. France had many of these services years before anywhere else. They had the internet before everyone else had the internet, effectively. They let the ball drop.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that, as we will see in subsequent parts, there are many aspects of Minitel, including the censorship aspect, that I think will kind of show us how much of our modern internet was not inevitable, right? It wasn't necessarily inevitable that the kind of content that is allowed to just proliferate online, I mean, think of all of the content that, at least in France, is illegal. Hate speech, fake news, cyberbullying, what have you, was not necessarily a fact of the internet. And there's pros and cons to taking any approach against it, but like I feel like in our modern discourse of the internet, we have this impression that like the internet is what it is and you can't change it. The best you can do is come up with regulations to try and like solve some of its worst abuses. But there's no room, at least that I see, in talking about how the internet could be meaningfully changed, like from an infrastructural and just structural perspective. we talked about the credit card aspect. If you talk to anyone about like regulating the internet and you say, hey, so I have this idea, what if we imposed on everybody to use a secure payment method? You would get pushback from Silicon Valley. You would get pushback from politicians. They would say, oh, the internet's free. You can't make me use smart payments, blah, 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 blah. Cryptocurrencies are the future. Well, the reality of this like unwillingness to look critically at the internet and think about its structure and think about how technology can be employed for like a public good means that we get the worst of all worlds, right? We get the payment platform that if it's only secure, if it's a bit secure, it's because it's constantly tracking where we are, how we use our phone. I mean, just think of all the things that try to detect if you're a robot, right? Those things, like maybe there's a world in which bots can be stopped by not making me solve impossible problems. Maybe there's a world in which every time I sign up for a service, I don't have to tell them where I live. There's so many aspects of the modern internet that are just taken as facts that I think Minitel gives us a window into a world in which we can start to ask, okay, maybe with some sort of governance, some sort of regulation, some sort of cooperation, we can find a way to make the internet a place that's not the hellhole that I think we all fear today.
Yeah. Now, I think that some people who could be listening will be balking at what you're implying there, which is that it would be better to have an internet whose infrastructure is all centralized under one public institution, as Minitel's one was under the PTT. Because even though you said that it wasn't a closed system and it wasn't, a restrictive system where everything was done by the state, it is still the case that all the benefits you're talking about come from the fact that all the infrastructure was run centrally by one, for the public benefit, in theory, by an arm of the government. And I think a lot of people would balk at that, especially in the US. But what I would say is that, as a response to those people, is that the libertarian internet of the 90s that won out over Minitel and similar concepts has led us to where we are today, where, yeah, sure, the infrastructure you're using is not state-owned. It's instead owned by several enormous, bloated, opaque private companies, right? Like, just think about the infrastructure of the internet you're using. Like, how much of it is run by Google or Amazon or your private telecommunication companies? Like, the internet is pretty darn centralized in that way today, but it's centralized in completely unaccountable private hands, which, I mean, Google no longer seems to really have any interest in even providing us with a good service, let alone to do so in a way that is ethical and for the public benefit.
Imagine we did want to solve the Google problem, or imagine Google even wanted to solve itself the Google problem, and it said, okay, we're going to start charging for searches. That wouldn't work. It just
no one would use them.
Yeah, no one would use them. You would switch somewhere else, and there would be no viable way for you to be charged for those searches without falling into the privacy and security problems with modern payments. So it's just not possible. It's just not possible without something changing.
But unfortunately, it's unlikely that change will come from the French government because, as you said, the PTT doesn't exist anymore. It was split up in 1990, and the telecommunications part was later privatized and is now Orange, which is minority state-owned. It's like 20-something% state-owned, but majority private. And then the mail division became La Poste, which is, rather shockingly, a private company. It's a private company that is owned by the state, but or owned by like the state's investment bank, the Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations, in a way that's sort of held at arm's length. But it's way more privatized than its equivalent in the US, which is kind of crazy. So there just isn't, the French government no longer has the capacity to develop something like this, which is sad.
So in future episodes, I think, we'll talk about the censorship aspect, some of the corruption perhaps that occurred within all this. We might look at, more specific comparisons between how Minitel worked and the modern French internet. But until then, please share this episode with your friends, whether they are interested in technology, politics, law, or are just francophiles. We're hoping to grow the show such that we can dedicate more of our time to it. So that really helps.
Yeah.
Until next time.
Thanks, everyone.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.